When mounting debt and a looming eviction notice pushed this youth pastor to the brink, he decided it would be easier to kill his family rather than tell them about the issues. The husband and father of 5 ran around his home with a knife, stabbing everyone inside and leaving 3 of them in critical condition. On top of all of that, he set the house on fire in an effort to cover up all the evidence. But that's not where the story ends. He survived a case of smoke inhalation and has now admitted freely in court he planned to murder his entire family. This case takes us to Shawnee, Kansas, about 15 minutes away from Kansas City. That's where 43-year-old Matthew Lee Richards lived with his family, a wife and their 5 kids. Matthew was kind of a staple in the community as well. He worked as a youth pastor at Crossroads Christian Church, and he focused mainly on kids aged pre-K all the way up to about 5th or 6th grade. According to KMBC, a local TV station there, he worked at Crossroads for 7 years. And according to the Kansas City Star, during the same time, he also taught English at Christ Preparatory Academy, and he started work there back in 2020. So on the outside, it seems like Matthew was the father and husband of a normal and happy family, and his wife and kids thought the same thing too. When the family started experiencing financial issues, Matthew didn't tell his wife or kids. It even got so bad that by 2023, the family was set to be evicted from their home, but no one knew about this except for Matthew. The family didn't even have any bags packed or anything boxed up. On September 15th, 2023, the family all went to bed as normal. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But September 16th was a deadline. It was the day the Richards family was supposed to be evicted from their home. In the early morning hours of that day, Matthew Lee Richards set the house on fire and then grabbed a knife. He later told investigators that the memory of that day comes back to him in flashes, but he does recall thinking he was a monster for trying to kill his family. But he also thought it would be easier if they all died rather than learn the truth. But that's not what happened. Johnson County Dispatch received 3 911 calls from the home, all reporting Matthew's attack. One was even from a child, saying their dad was chasing them around the house with a knife. Calls came in about the fire too, and when first responders arrived to the scene, they actually heard an explosion coming from the garage. Waiting outside for first responders were 3 members of the Richards family, his wife and 2 of his kids, and they all had critical injuries. One of the kids had been slashed across their stomach, and it was so deep that first responders could see their internal organs. As most of the family was rushed to the hospital, first responders on the scene were able to contain the fire and eventually put it out completely. They also found Matthew inside. He was suffering from smoke inhalation. So he was taken to the hospital and treated for that. And as soon as he was safe and cleared, he was taken into custody. After all of this, Matthew confessed to everything too. According to court documents, he told investigators, "I stabbed my family." Here's a really good time to note why we haven't given the name of Matthew's wife or any of the children, because they all miraculously survived. We're not mentioning their names to keep their privacy, and that's what local Kansas and Missouri outlets have done too. We will note, though, that Matthew's former employer, the Crossroads Christian Church, set up a fund for the family after the attack to help with expenses. The church released a statement after all of this. It reads in part, quote, "The Crossroads Christian Church family is shocked, sickened, and saddened by the events involving our former children's pastor. This is a tragedy beyond what any of us could have imagined. We give our full cooperation and support to the Shawnee Police Department and the Johnson County Sheriff's Department as they conduct their investigation. We are offering support and resources to the members of the Richards family who are victimized and their extended family. The road to recovery will be long physically, mentally, emotionally, and spiritually. Please respect their privacy as they walk this incredibly challenging and painful road. Please join us as we continue to pray and stand with them. We also ask for your respect and prayers for the many children and families affected by this incident. We are all grieving with our dear friends who are deeply hurting in so many ways. Crossroads Christian Church will offer grief counseling for children and families in the coming days and weeks." 2 days after the attack, Matthew was arraigned, and according to the Kansas City Star, he faced 4 charges of attempted murder, 1 charge of capital murder, and 1 more charge of aggravated arson. There has been some movement in this case recently, though. Just this month, Matthew once again admitted responsibility for the attack and accepted a plea deal on February 11th. All right, so we kind of went through all of the details of the case, but I want to dig even deeper. So we've got to bring on our expert guest today. That's Chase Brown, criminal defense attorney and former prosecutor. And Chase, I want to start with the prosecutorial side of things because in this case, we have a father who attempted to murder not only his wife, but five of his children as well. I mean, just to start, that's a lot for the survivors to have to deal with, right?
Absolutely, absolutely, and it's something that I'm sure every single day they're reliving in their minds because it's something a trauma that no one could even imagine having gone through.
The trauma is something that I can't even imagine that they had to go through. The shining light in all of this, though, is that they did survive this terrible incident. So I'm sure investigators and prosecutors would want to talk with them and see what happened. How does that work, though, without re traumatizing them or re victimizing them?
Unfortunately, it's just part of the process. There really is no way around it because when they're interviewing them, everything is in preparation for trial, for court. Everything has to be done a certain way. So it's a process that they have to get into these details that these kids are going to have to talk to them about, and it's something again that is it's horrible. So they're really the answer is there's really no way around the going through it again in these interviews, and they will be interviewed multiple times because sometimes a young child will come in the first time and not be able to tell all of it, and they'll come back. So it's a process, but there's no way around it.
It's so sad that anyone who has to go through something like this, not just this case, but any, has to relive it in that way. But you're right, their testimony would be so valuable for prosecutors in all of the court proceedings. So we talked about kind of the mental health side of things, but there were physical ailments, obviously, too. When investigators or first responders got to the scene, three people were in critical condition. One of the reports I read said you could see the internal organs on one of the children. They were rushed to the hospital, unclear if we're going to survive. So I'm sure investigators right away want to talk to these people when it's fresh, when it just happened. But does that make things more complicated because these people are dealing with physical ailments? They're fighting for their lives. So time is really potentially not on the side of the prosecutors at that point.
It's not. But I'm sure investigators will go to the hospital. They'll try and speak to whoever they can. They'll maybe wait a day or two till they're out of that critical stage. But yeah, it's something that you have to get on right away, obviously, to keep it fresh in their mind. But obviously, they have to get out of this critical condition state first.
Right, that is the most important thing. And again, the underlying shiny beacon of hope in that everyone survived in this case. Another person who was treated, though, is the father, Matthew Lee Richards. He had smoke inhalation. So he was taken to the hospital, treated, discharged. And then he speaks with investigators. And right away, he says something like, I attempted to kill my family. I tried to kill my family. That confession, is that super important?
Absolutely, absolutely, because it shows the intent and the premeditation of it. Because there's a defense people will put on of insanity, maybe even extreme emotional distress. But him saying that after the fact just goes right to the intent. So that statement, that confession is absolutely essential for trial and just showing that it is in fact intentional. It was premeditated. It was planned. It's not something that he came up with right away on the spot where there's a defense to it.
The premeditation fact is what's so important in the charges that he faces. The fact that it wasn't a snap decision, as you said. Explain this to me if this is correct. It doesn't mean that this person had to have been planning this for months or years or even days ahead of time, but it could be premeditation right before the crime. Is that right?
That is. And one of the instructions, especially in New York, the jury instructions the judge will give, it says that intent can be formed within seconds, right up to the crime. It's not something that you need to wait on for weeks. But this statement, especially, I think, goes to show because obviously a jury might have a harder time going along with the seconds, even though that's an instruction. They might have a hard time. But if you have a confession saying that it's not a few seconds, that it's minutes, hours, days, that's very big for the jury, and it goes towards proving the intent much easier. But yes, it is something that can be formed seconds before.
You're right. The fact that we heard this specifically from him or investigators heard it from his mouth, I attempted to kill my family, I tried to kill them. I mean, that's pretty hard to combat when it comes to pleading in any way, which eventually he did end up with a plea deal, pleading guilty to 2 out of the 5 original charges. What do you think those negotiations were looking like?
So a plea in this case is for a multitude of reasons. It's first of all, it's going to deal with the fact that these kids would have to testify, right? You're going to have to put each kid on the stand. They're each going to have to live through it again. And the first, what you're going to experience for the first time at trial is cross-examination. So anyone can give a statement and speak and tell their story. However, they're never challenged. But now you're going to have a defense attorney who's going to get up there, who's going to cross-examine them and challenge every little thing they said, from the first interview to the third interview, and then up until the prep before trial. So there's something about said about putting these kids through that process again. Another thing is trial is a funny thing. What I mean by that is you never know what's going to happen. You could prep your witnesses, and I've been there. You prep your witnesses and you put them on the stand, and they say something completely different, and you're stuck. So there's always a risk from either side of going to trial. So I'm sure that it was worked out where we won't go forward on all the charges. We'll, you plead to 2, and this, you won't be maxed out for life. And in addition, you're doing the right thing by not forcing your kids and your wife to go through this process.
And that kind of goes to the re-victimization that we were talking about earlier in the interview. Exactly to your point, if these kids have to relive it in front of their father, the person who did this to them, I'm sure that's something that prosecutors wanted to avoid. I wanted to talk about the original charges too. I jumped ahead because I was interested in the plea deal, but let's go back to the charges. Originally, it was 4 counts of attempted murder, which checks out, makes sense to me. But then the 5th was of capital murder. Can you explain that to me, why it might be 4 of attempted and then 1 of capital?
It's probably has something to do with the fact that it was so many attempted murders. It's an aggravating factor. So I know that sometimes you'll have a murder 2 versus a murder 1, and a murder 1 could be because you kill multiple people, even though it's still murder, but because you do multiple people, kill multiple people at once. In this case, probably because it's the attempted murders, he was trying to kill so many people. It's probably the aggravating factor to get it from the attempted murder to the capital murder, which is here. Some other factors could be the fact that there was the fire involved, that he tried to set the house on fire. So there's aggravating factors that will elevate you from that attempted murder up to the capital murder.
You talked about the fire, which she also faced an arson charge in all of this. And to me, I'm thinking that that's a way that he's hoping to cover his tracks, to kind of get rid of some of the evidence. Do you think that might have been the motive for setting the fire?
That's tough to say. I don't know if it was just in this rage of whatever he's going through. He just decides to burn the house down and keep, finish. I guess finish the job is kind of a morbid way to say it, but that's maybe how it was. The the defense certainly will use I would use the fire aspect in his favor, because it's going to show that mental state might not be he might not be sane, right? We want to go for some kind of defense, and he's not. He's just so out of control that he's doing anything and everything to hurt his family. So that's something I would try and use in his favor to, at trial as a potential defense.
That's interesting. Just theorizing about what would have happened when this goes to trial, what sort of defense they could have brought. I also was wondering about motive too, because this is something we talk about a lot on Law and Crime. You don't need a motive to prove that somebody is guilty of a crime or convict them. However, it's the question we all want to know: why? Why would something like this happen? And in this case, it seems to me the motive is pretty clear. The fact that this family rather, was going to be evicted from their home the day of these attempted murders, that they had all these financial hardships that were hidden from the wife and the 5 children. To me, that motive is pretty crystal clear. What do you think?
It is, but you're going to have a hard time. So going back to the motive, right? The jury, there's no requirement, but a jury is always going to want to know the motive, because it's not going to make sense to them that someone would just do this without a reason. So they're going to want that motive. Now, the fact that it's because he was going to lose the house because of financial difficulties, that's something as a prosecutor you need to convince the jury is a clear motive, because they might not buy that is really the reason to go about these horrible acts just because you were going to lose the house. So I think you need to bring in other evidence to support that really is the motive. That maybe there's a history of financial issues, or there's other things that was going on in his life, that this kind of just was the final breaking straw. Because the jury's always going to need, legally they don't need it, but they're going to need it in their heads. It's always in the back of their heads.
I have to wonder too if prosecutors would really attack his character or his credibility as a husband in the fact that this wife had no clue about any of it. She thought everything was good. She was unaware of this eviction. I know you kind of explained that prosecutors would really have to go to prove, yes, this was the reason for these attempted murders. But the fact that he kept it secret from his wife and his kids, they had not packed their bags. They were supposed to leave that very day. Is that something prosecutors might hammer home?
They would. They would. They're gonna try and bring in everything they can. Um, Maybe there's a history of domestic violence. Maybe there's something else going on there that we don't necessarily know about that they wouldn't publicize to the news quite yet. There's always something else going on there. So they're gonna try and get every piece of evidence they can, and then some, because this is something that we don't want to put anyone through and then end up with a not guilty or something lesser. So yes, they're gonna try and find every little, had it gone to trial, every little thing possible to introduce against him.
Talking about bringing up credibility or talking about his personality, something that we're seeing throughout all of the articles in this is the fact that our defendant was a person of faith. He was a minister, a youth minister, even for kids pre K ages up until about sixth grade. So, really young kids, and then goes and turns his back on his own family, children, attempts to kill them too. Is that something prosecutors would bring up a lot too?
They would. They would. They certainly would. I think that the defense is going would use that in their favor, sort of mitigation factors, and that would go towards to combat the premeditation. To say that he just snapped because he's a community person, he's a pastor, he's with kids every single day, doing helping the community. So what happened? What changed? What was that split second change that led him to commit these horrible acts? So the prosecution would certainly bring it up, and I think the defense even more so would play on that. That's another strategy, another thing to bring up at trial to help him.
I like talking to you about this specifically because you have experience both as a prosecutor and a defense attorney. So when I'm going to a question and I'm asking about the prosecution side of things, you're like, wait a sec, the defense would actually do all of this. So you're really enlightening me about all of this. I wanted to ask about sentencing, though, just one more question for you. And it's that we didn't have a jury trial. So all of this evidence was not presented in the way that we sometimes normally see. How does that factor in for sentencing? The fact that no jury had to see any of this? Would a judge go over the information? Would both sides have to present it to the judge? I mean, what would that look like?
So I know in New York, and I'm sure other states do it, where we do something called a pre-sentence investigation, where the probation department will interview the defendant, get a full, essentially workup, I would say, of their history, other factors in their life, and then they'll actually reach out to the victims, right, the family members who are involved, and see what their take is on everything. And then I'm sure that the defense attorney will be advocating for his client, and then the prosecution will be advocating for the victim. So there's definitely a lot that goes into it. But however, it's a plea. It's something that's worked out. So the sentence is already determined. There are circumstances where maybe something comes up in this report or through talking to people that the judge may change his mind. But generally speaking, once it's agreed upon and you're dismissing charges and pleading to certain charges, the sentence is worked out prior to that plea.
Really, the bottom line in all of this is that it's such a heartbreaking case for the family. Again, the shining light, the fact that everyone survived, but really tough to have to deal with. So our hearts go out to all of them. Chase, thank you so much for coming on with us today and breaking down the case.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
Matthew Lee Richards is due back in court on March 26th for sentencing. Reporting for Law&Crime, I'm Sierra Gillespie.